Many people rightly find today's gospel one of the most moving and impressive in the whole New Testament. It seems boundlessly rich and suggestive. Just to say the word Emmaus brings to mind and heart certain experiences that we associate with our own hearts burning within us. Those times when we knew the presence of Christ on the journey, or special times when we recognized him in the breaking of bread, when we felt especially close to Jesus at Mass. As I read this gospel passage, I'm struck with how much the two disciples knew of what had happened in Jerusalem. They knew how Jesus had suffered and how he was put to death. They also knew the witness of the women who reported that the tomb was empty and that others had gone to the tomb as well to see the tomb empty. It's like they had all of the pieces of the puzzle, but they couldn't put the pieces together to understand the fullness of truth until they spent time with the risen Christ. And then everything seems to fall into place. Their hearts are seemingly on fire, and they know the truth of the resurrection. And then they have to return to Jerusalem, even in the darkness, to share the truth. The symbolism of the Emmaus story is important to note. It's thought that Emmaus was a Roman city of military importance. Jerusalem was a place of the cross and suffering love. Emmaus represented the security of the world and the sword. So when these disciples are confronted with the death of Jesus, instead of staying with the community of believers in Jerusalem, these disciples head out on their own towards worldly hopes and security. They turn away from the cross. In biblical terms, they are walking the wrong way, looking in the wrong place for their security. But even though they flee, Jesus doesn't give up on them. He seeks them out. He goes to where they are, and he meets them in their place. And even for a while, the Lord accompanies them in the wrong direction. The scriptures once again remind us that we don't have a God who waits for us to come back to him, but God is always searching us out, coming out to meet us. And God will even go with us for a while in the wrong direction. Interestingly, the gospel says that as Jesus drew near to them, their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. Why? Because they were walking in the wrong way. How true that is. When we walk in ways contrary to the gospel, when we turn away from the cross or seek our security in worldly things, we hardly ever see Jesus clearly. And so what happens in the gospel? Jesus asks a question in faux innocence. What are you discussing as you walk along? And the gospel says that they stopped. So, if we are walking in the wrong direction, the first thing we have to do is stop. That's simple enough. If we're walking in the wrong direction today, if you're walking in a way contrary to the gospel, if you find yourself turning away from the cross and the way of suffering love, or if you seek your security in worldly things, then stop. That's the first step of the journey with Christ to Emmaus, stopping, so that you can next spend time with Jesus, to listen to him, to share your burdens with him, to tell him of what you know about life and death and suffering, and to allow him to reveal his plan and grace in your life. The crux of the Emmaus story is found in these words of Jesus to the disciples. How foolish you are! How slow of heart to believe all that the prophet spoke! Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? That is the real key to putting the puzzle of the Passion together, the suffering love of Christ. The culmination of God's love for humanity and salvation history found its pivotal point in the suffering love of Christ on the cross. The cross was the means by which the promises of God in the Old Testament is fulfilled. Christ's death and resurrection brings God's glory, the freedom from sin and victory over death. So don't turn away from the cross. Don't turn away from the way of suffering love. Instead, as a follower of Jesus, his disciples are to embrace that way of love. And so while they were at table during a meal, in a manner reminiscent of the Last Supper and of the Eucharist, Jesus takes the bread. He blesses it, breaks it, and shares it. And in that moment of sacrificial love, the disciples finally get it. Their eyes are opened, and they return to Jerusalem even though it was night. They are back walking the right way, the way of suffering love. The Emmaus story is such a rich passage. As I read the Emmaus story again today, I think of the times in life when I feel like I have a multitude of puzzle pieces, experiences and feelings and information. The longer I live, the more puzzle pieces I seem to have, and the more complicated the puzzle seems to become. This time of staying at home during the coronavirus pandemic has for many of us been puzzle piece after puzzle piece. Complications and difficulties and powerful graces, family togetherness, economic hardship, health worries, puzzle piece after puzzle piece. Interestingly, many families have taken to putting jigsaw puzzles together as a family activity done at home during our stays there, and I think that's a good one to do. But simply having the pieces of life, having knowledge, knowing our feelings, those aren't enough to put the puzzle together. I can't do it on my own. For me to know the truth requires me to bring my life to the crucified and risen one, who helps me sort through all of the pieces of life to discover the deeper meanings and the fullness of life. Remember, the real key to putting the puzzle of this passion together was suffering love. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things to enter into his glory? The same is true for us. The key for putting the puzzle of our lives together is also suffering love. When you're asked to endure a hardship or to embrace a suffering, and you find yourself struggling and questioning or thinking, this just isn't worth it, take out a crucifix and look at it for a moment and ask, which way am I walking? Am I walking away from the cross or towards the cross and his love? If you are walking away from the cross, then stop and spend some time with Christ today, with Christ who heals you with his suffering love. Friends, Emmaus was not just a place for two disciples in 33 AD. Emmaus is for us today. It's the place we go when life is difficult. Maybe it's the place we go when we want to escape. And there are probably some people today who are making their way to Emmaus as they stay at home. But the Lord continually seeks us out, and Emmaus becomes also the place to bring the mystery of each of our lives to the crucified and risen one, in the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the cup, in the mystery and healing of suffering love. May our hearts burn within us today as we bring our lives to Christ. Praise be Jesus Christ, now and forever. Amen.